panelists to rejoin us in sound and vision. And then I'm going to whip through these questions. So if I can ask for short questions and, in the nicest way, panel, short answers, that would be great. I'm going to start with something that Doug Jackson posed right early on in the evening. What do the panel think about the National Beef Association proposal suggestion to tax older cattle to reduce emissions, especially where native breeds are the slowest growing, most suited to extensive and hill systems? Other land uses are limited. Tim, do you want to start with that one?
I guess I think the same as the pasture-fed livestock association, which is that sounds a bit dark to me.
Doug.
Yeah, silly idea. They withdrew it pretty quickly. Traditional breeds on grass, lower carbon footprint, end of.
Minette.
I've had more comment on this, I think, than many other things, but yes, it was quite an extraordinary move for the National Beef Association, and no wonder they retracted it pretty quickly, because I think there was a whole deluge of frustration, shall we say, out there.
And Hugh?
That doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense to me. Efficiencies can be gained regardless of the system, whether extensive or intensive. You get some very efficient extensive systems and some very inefficient intensive systems. So that policy wouldn't make any sense to me.
Let's move on to a question from Victoria Chandler. How important does the panel feel the role of technological developments like gene editing have to play in our reduced reliance on chemical input? And do you think we can win the argument that this research can benefit the environment, not ruin it? Surely, she says, it's key to our net zero ambitions. Minette?
I thought you'd come to me first.
I'm so predictable.
And I'm sure there's going to be a big difference of opinion. I mean, look, we have always had a positive position on GM, and what I'm delighted about is GM is in an era of the past, and new plant breeding technologies is a completely different thing. And I think it is going to be incredibly important. And we tend to, when we have this discussion, we tend to just think UK full stop. When I look at the impact across the world, the challenges of drought, the challenges of climate change, you know, too much and too little rainfall, the damage that a heavy food production footprint has, then new plant breeding that can cope with the changes in climatic conditions has got to be one of the tools in the box on the way forward. But Charlotte, you'd pick a fight in an empty room on this very subject, and I'm sure you have.
Doug?
Yeah, I think it's essential. I mean, I was saying earlier, I didn't like when Boris talks about the UK leading the technological solutions to climate change, but actually this is an area where technology really can make a huge difference. If we can gene edit wheat to produce its own nitrogen, why wouldn't you? If we can increase the climate resilience of certain crops and varieties, why wouldn't you? The problem with gene editing and the whole GM debate is Monsanto. You know, they made such a monumental cock up, excuse my language, of launching Roundup Ready soya and maize or whatever it was in the US to answer one question, a single issue, where actually they created a whole load of other issues, notably now glyphosate resistance. So yeah, it was a ridiculous move, but I think there is a bright future for gene editing in this country, and it forms part of the solution.
Hugh, do you see a bright future for gene editing?
I was going to dodge the bullet on gene editing and talk more generally about genetic improvement and the role of genetic improvement, because there is a really positive steps that can be made by understanding the genetics more and being able to show how they can be used in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and whether that's identifying the genetics for reductions in NTAC fermentation, or improving production efficiency through a wider suite of genetic improvements. Both have a role.
Tim?
I think go for the lower hanging fruit first. Let's get measurement right. Let's get our soil systems going right. And playing around genetics, yeah, I think that sort of comes after. But a perennial high yielding wheat would be fantastic, I can imagine. So yeah, there's a place for it, but I think the low hanging fruit first.
Okay, I want to put two questions together here, one from an anonymous person and one from Andrew Samuel, but the same sort of idea. Anonymous says, with the loss of the BPS and uncertainty about what is to follow, will this not accelerate the regenerative movement? While there's no BPS to pass on, the associated industries are really going to struggle. But how do I, as a tenant, pay the rent if my experiment fails? I can't afford to lose the farm and the house the family lives in. I know I can keep going currently doing what they're doing. Andrew Samuel asks, how do tenant farmers achieve net zero on short-term agreements? Hugh.
Ooh, it's it's probably one that I don't necessarily feel that qualified to respond to, really. I think it's something that the market really needs to reward. We need to figure out what the market is going to reward and what where the future payments, the ELM payments, sort of pick up where the public good element and where there's essentially a market failure. And there's this sort of grey area between where market failure and the market does pick up, and that's a massive challenge for DEFRA, I believe.
Doug.
Well, yeah, I alluded to this in my piece, but yeah, I think land tenure is one of the most tricky issues as far as developing regenerative farming system is concerned. And yeah, anyone who's on a 1 to 3 year FBT isn't going to necessarily invest in regenerating their soils if there's a fear they might lose that land at the end of the tenancy. So I think we need a root and branch change in the way tenancies are structured, and see landlords and tenants working much more in harmony, and taking the landlord on the regenerative farming journey as well. I've got a horrible feeling that when we start seeing things like carbon payments, that will all end up in the landlord's hands.
Tim.
So a couple of points. I guess we need to see going into regenerative farming as R&D. So we should be able to get R&D tax credits for carrying out that work to try and de-risk the change. And there's what I try to do on putting these sort of things in place is to think, how can I make something scalable? So start off small that you can scale up, and always think about how it could be bigger, and keep it mobile and keep it cheap. But yeah, it's much like.
Minette.
Look, I think we're quite unique with the size of the tenanted sector that we have in this country, and I think it does ultimately need sort of root and branch reform in many ways. It's going to be, I think, about embracing a very different future, and I say this very honestly at my frustration at a government that I feel has not necessarily been particularly honest to date, and we are out of time. We are less than 2 months from leaving the transition period, and we have followed this journey with something that is going to be a policy that is much, much better than the CAP, and still the industry has no idea what that looks like. We've seen a retraction from the active farmer approach in the new policy, which means that other people will be able to enter the new policy. So what does it mean for tenants? I think it's a very, very grey area at the moment. And what we have to look at, and what I have always looked at in my business, is factoring out direct support, because we are going to be working on parliamentary cycles for funding. We're going to be competing against the NHS, education. So this has to be a business plan like no other, and this has to deliver multifaceted public return on that investment. And the CAP ultimately had ended up being a social policy, and a social policy is not part of the ELM's thinking. So if it is going to come, it's going to come from somewhere else, and I genuinely do not believe it will come from this government that is opposed to social policy. And therein are some big, big questions to be answered, because Brexit is going to definitely mean there will be a much more competition on the marketplace, much more. And we are going out of a multi-annual budget into a multi-annual plan. So you're back to the NHS and education. So these are game changers. So if I'm looking at my business now, I'm thinking, actually, do you know what? I want to park the whole sports side of it, and I want to look at a business model that can stack up on its own. Now, if we can all pull down funding and incentives, which I believe we can make the case for, then that's great. But for the tenanted sector, this is a period of enormous change. So much will depend on landlord-tenant relationship. The whole approach to contract farming is going to be massively different. And the future, without doubt, is going to be about a shared approach, a shared ambition with landlord and tenant, because it just simply is not going to work any other way. If those two can come together and collaborate, and we see much of it going on across the country now, it will work. If they're not, it won't work. It'll be very, very difficult.
Okay, question from William Brandreth. Within the UK, is there any leadership on a coordinated protocol and standards for carbon accounting on UK farms that will ensure we implement the UN IPCC best practice? Who wants to field that? Who knows the answer to this question? Look, nobody's volunteering. Hugh, any ideas?
Yeah, well, there's discussions about various different means of gathering information, and we do sort of apply a sort of IPCC FAO type guidance on how to measure soil carbon, for example. So there are protocols in how you should take samples and to what depth. There's not great clarity around whether you should use a DUMAS approach or a loss ignition test, which would be nice if we had some consistency around that area, because they do both yield slightly different responses, for example. A general consensus on that, some guidance, and a sort of, let's say, a working group to figure that one out would be a very useful thing.
Doug, realistically, how much longer can we go on not having an agreed way that we're going to do this?
Oh, crikey. Well, I mean, if a carbon market is to develop, we need a recognised way of doing this, and it can't come soon enough, really. At the moment, we're using recognised metrics that Hugh alluded to, and we're using academics to help us verify and back up what we're saying and doing. And hopefully we will be working with academics to further that work. But at the moment, there is no recognised way of benchmarking it, and so we're well, I'm going to say we're at the forefront of trying to come up with a solution, but actually struggling. Yeah.
Tim, you're a bit dubious.
Sorry,
Hugh, go ahead.
The Australian model actually for their carbon scheme in Australia is actually very, very useful as a guide, actually, and we've used that quite a lot in terms of the development of protocol for soil sampling and measurement. But something that's uniform along those lines would be very useful for the industry.
Tim, you're a bit dubious about this. What will someone have to show you before you think, yeah, that's worth signing up to?
Well, I really took on board what Professor Miles Allen said at the NFU conference, and which was really about addressing the burps and farts. I can't say that big word, but the fermentation of burps and farts, and how we measure that, and that made much more sense to me. Which was, and his as I remember it, his idea was the IPC measurements were a bit skewed away from livestock and away from the benefit. So they overplayed the impact of the ruminant livestock sector, and we've got to address that. And we've got to actually have clarity on what the real figure is. I don't think anyone really knows.
I mean, might we get some of this as part of an ELM?
Oh, I mean, that's the whole reason for us working on this sustainable food and farming scheme, to look at the policy that is needed to get there. And I think there are two things. Tim makes the fundamental point around the Miles Allen work. It's got to be an international inventory. You can't have different situation across the world. There's got to be one size effectively fits all in all of this, because otherwise you end up, and at the moment we have got different things that are going on, and the reason why we have to keep going and we have to do this is because it's going to be forced on us anyway. I mean, if I look at what New Zealand is doing, they're already building it into their farm assurance. They haven't been working with any sort of comprehensive policy for agriculture, and obviously agriculture in New Zealand is a serious emitter, and at the moment those farmers, all they are getting is taxed and taxed and taxed. Now, for us as farmers here in the UK, we are literally, with legislation in place to deliver net zero by 2050, do you want to be taxed, guys, or do you want to get ahead of this and be able to look at a broad approach that ultimately can get you to that place. Well, it's obvious that we want to go to a broad approach that can allow farmers to get to that place. It's going to be better for the business, it's going to be better for the environment, it's better for soil health, and that's the route we've got to take. But you can't stand back from this because the world is demanding it, and there's a very clear case that it needs action and we need to do it.
Sebastian Anstruther asks, is it reasonable and does it strengthen our case to include on-farm energy generation in the net zero calculation? Shouldn't we be aiming for net zero food production? Doug?
Well, yes, we should be aiming for net zero food production. I completely agree with that point. And if we can reduce our net impact by producing green energy as well, then that is another contribution that we're making to UK net zero, not just our own farm net zero.
Tim?
So I remember reading a book talking about the number of calories of oil it takes to produce 1 calorie of food. In America, it was 10 to 1. The 10 calories of oil-based products to produce 1 calorie of food. So if that is true or near to true, then we've got to address our energy production as well. So I think it is right to include the fact that energy is involved in food production. So we need to get some renewables in there.
Hugh?
Yeah, completely. I mean, it's we have the opportunity to create renewable energy on farm, and we should be doing it. It's as Doug said about a sort of wider economy approach. It's not just about agriculture. We've got an economy-wide net zero target that we've got to address, and the more that we can contribute to the decarbonisation of the energy sector, the better. Whether we then can account for those emissions reductions as part of our net zero target is the big question. And I believe that an emissions removal or an emissions reduction or decarbonisation of the energy sector isn't necessarily within the boundaries of the agricultural production system.
Do you think you can claim it, Minette?
We think that it's, I talked about the 3 pillars, of which renewable energy is a massive part of it. The bioeconomy is a huge part of that. I mean, it's already been a big part, renewable energy, of on-farm diversification, and it's been a very valuable part. If I look to things like the renewable heat incentive, we've got to embrace energy as part of what farmers can deliver on. So I think it's totally integral. And it's horses for courses. Some farmers will choose to probably just farm the environment. Others will want to be producing carbon neutral food. Others will be focused on green energy as well. And I think, we 70% of the UK is a farmed landscape. So we can offer, I think, such a phenomenal return on that investment. And what I said about we can't keep taking out of the inner earth, I genuinely think this is our time. This is the time when we can be growing things on top of the earth in a much better way than we ever have done before, with the new tech, the new innovations. And I just think this is our opportunity to drive a new approach to not only sustainable food production, but sustainable living as well. We can't keep on with the man-made fibers that we have at the moment that just run our lives.
Okay, 2 questions sort of slightly in opposition. Dom Lee, can't much of the cost of getting to net zero be met by other industries offsetting their carbon footprint by buying carbon credits from UK agriculture? Peter Appleton, though, says, on the subject of carbon trading and the role it plays in net zero, is there a risk of selling out agriculture's positive contribution to offset other less environmentally friendly industries? Hugh, you talked a bit about this, the double accounting.
Yeah, it's something that needs some very careful thought about how we actually do trade away the carbon that is sequestered into agriculture. There's a big opportunity. There's no doubt that land is basically the resource that we have to sequester carbon from the atmosphere at the moment. And as industries across the economy try to decarbonize, they will be looking for offsets, and they will be willing to pay for those offsets. And I think from an agricultural perspective, I'm slightly torn as to whether we take that money and look and invest it in other decarbonizing approaches in agriculture. So ways of reducing enteric fermentation, ways of removing the necessity for other reactive nitrogen, sort of investing in hydrogen powered tractors, in all of these things. So using the money productively that way, or whether we say we must be net zero before we trade anything out of agriculture. To be honest, I'm a bit torn between the two.
Tim.
Oh, geez, that's a big question for me. I'm not sure I can answer. The only thing I can answer or think of when I hear this talk is that maybe I ought to go and plough up my ground and start reducing my carbon as much as I can. Because I'm not so sure in those conversations that I'm going to get paid for what I've already got.
Minette.
Well, to a certain extent, it's already happening. You know, it is already going on, and I think the way that Elms is set up for the future, with tiers 1 and 2, and then tier 3 effectively being the real partnership point of public and private sector coming together, and you know, really seeing joined up collaborative approach. I think why would we as farmers, landowners, land managers, tenants, why would we not take ownership in this area? And this has been for us the whole driver of wanting to get farmers ahead of the game, to stop the reactive conversation and become the solutions. And that, I think, has to happen. Who knows, quite ultimately the market, Charlotte, is going to drive everything. You know, the market will always win, whether we like that or not. So if the market is there, farmers, as we all know, farmers will follow the money, and that ultimately is what it boils down to. Except my 3 colleagues here, I think, are above all of that and following the money and doing massively the right thing at unprecedented levels.
Doug.
Yeah, look, I think we as farmers, we all need to get our house in order first and make sure that we are at net zero at worst, and preferably sequestering a bit of a buffer. But then why not sell the additional carbon that we are sequestering to those that cannot? There will be industries out there that just can't do anything about it, you know, why not take that opportunity? And yes, maybe Hugh's right. Maybe that money should be used to invest in farms to make us even more efficient, you know, in the future. But I think the opportunity exists. As long as we've got a house in order first, we ought to be able to sell the excess to other industries.
I'm going to end with 2 shoved together questions, which don't really go together, so bear with me. Elizabeth Buchanan loves the ideas, particularly, Tim, that you were talking about, but says you have a huge acreage. So how does all this work on a smaller family farm? How will that manage in this new world? And I'll just get down to the bottom. Hugh, I think, Hugh Goldsworthy, and I'm sorry, Hugh, I'm just going to make this a lot shorter, says, in this moral dilemma between looking after the environment, net zero, and producing food, do we sign up to feed our nation or look after our soils and profitability? Tim, let's start with you on that.
Okay, I'll take the first one. Yeah, sometimes I wish I had a much smaller farm, because I wouldn't have to work with as many partners, and I could work with my family, and then I wouldn't have to have such expensive systems in place that you know, they make them more fail-safe, because other people are more idiot than I am. So if I had a smaller farm, I think I quite like it. I think every farm's got its unfair advantage, and we need to try and view that. Joel Salatin, who's almost the leader in this sort of enterprise stacking thing, has done that on a 500-acre farm. I don't think that it's necessarily all about scale. I think it's probably about mindset as well. But it's getting that first step is the really challenging thing. I can't remember the other question, so pass it on to someone else.
Doug, the other question was about, where do you choose? Do you choose to produce loads of food, or do you choose to go net zero and do all the good stuff?
I don't think the two are exclusive. I mean, we can produce lots of food and be regenerative. I sort of coined the phrase regenerative intensification. You know, in our arable rotation, and Tim's doing the same, we're now stacking livestock on forage crops and selling forage and sequestering carbon and increasing our soil organic matter and our soil health, which is in turn leading to us being able to produce actually more food for less, which is the holy grail. We want to be able to produce more food because we have more healthy soils that need less artificial intervention and actually maintain plant health. So yeah, you can do both. You don't have to do one or the other.
Hugh.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The two are not mutually exclusive, and we need to be finding ways of achieving both of those goals.
Minette.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't do it any other way. And this, I think, is the exciting part about doing this. It, as I said at the beginning, it is really good for the business. It's really good for the planet. I mean, we've taken half of our fertilizer costs out by continually getting our grass lays to improve and lay down, you know, more nitrogen within the grass. So, you know, it's doable. And we've just, I think, you know, the criticism of the cap, of which will probably continue forever and a day now, and we have it within our grass to dictate a different future. But the ability to be able to produce a bigger yield because you're farming better, that's a win for everybody, because that's a win for that business, and that's a win for what you're producing, and you're causing less damage with the way that you're farming. So I just think that is in a very exciting time. But the policy, Charlotte, getting the policy right, you know, if we're just going to focus on stewardship, which, you know, has been a lot of the thinking, if we're just going to focus on the perimeters of our fields, our hedges, that isn't enough. We've got to enter right into the middle of the field and focus on the soils, which sits at the heart of this, and the core business with what I said about resources, you know, clean air, clean water and everything else. We've got to look at a different way of policy and a different way of farming.
And there we have to leave it. Can I thank our panelists, Hugh, Tim, Doug and Minette, and also thank Duncan, Wiz and Sarah for keeping us actually on the screen and even to time. Duncan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for doing what you do so well. It gives me great confidence as an organizer that we're in safe hands. Just need to make sure we can book you in for next year. As a conference organizer, I mean, I've done this for a number of years now, and I always worry about whether people are actually going to step up and ask questions and get the debate going. And this year I worried more than ever because we're online. I don't know why I worried, because the questions just came in thick and fast. So that was just fantastic. I've got another question to ask the audience, just to sort of finish off with, if I may, and if Sarah's ready. And that is to achieve net zero by 2040. The subject that we've been talking about, you know, will we require radical change? Is it going to be radical change or more of an evolution? So the choices are, is this going to need radical change, or is this going to be more of an evolution? So again, if you could tick the box, and we'll give you about 30 seconds and then just see what people come up with. Okay, Sarah, where are we with the results? That's interesting. It's quite close. So we got for radical change 42%, but for evolution 58%. Interesting result. Thank you. So all it leaves me to do now is really to thank everyone involved. I'm going to start with the South of England Agricultural Society staff. All of them in different ways have been involved, from the sort of the PR element of it to tweeting this evening. But the two in particular I want to thank is our Wiz, who, you know, she actually does the hard work here. I just sort of make all the noise, etc., but she actually does the work. And Sarah as well, who's really held the technology together for us this evening, and we couldn't have done it without either of those two. My conference committee as well, I chair it, but we've also got Doug Jackson on there, Wiz as well, and Chris Appleton. You know, their ideas, etc., feed into this. Couldn't do it without those guys. Charlotte, again, for chairing our conference with such panache and such competence, and making the life of the conference organisers so easy. Our speakers, they give us their time, they give us their knowledge, but particularly this evening, I felt they gave us a lot of inspiration as well. That, you know, our industry has got such an important role to play with this whole agenda, but this, you know, this belief that the industry is going to be able to step up and deliver this. Our sponsors, I thanked them at the beginning. I'm going to thank them again now. you know, CLM, Mayo, Win Baxter, Richard Place Dobson, Lloyds Bank, NFU Mutual, Fram Farmers, and our media partner, Southeast Farmer. You know, it's a difficult year to be a sponsor because they're not going to get the same exposure as they would if they were there in person and had this ability to actually chat to people as they were having their fantastic buffet, Charlotte, and a few beers. But they stuck with us, and we're very, very grateful for that. And then lastly, to the audience, the attendees who've come along and asked all the questions and being here again, you know, fantastic that you turned up in this virtual world. So that's it. That's me done. Hopefully, I've not forgotten to thank anybody, but if I have, sorry, and thank you to whoever you are. So I'm just going to finish by saying thanks and good night to you all. Cheers all.